Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we talk to Professor Eugene Rogan, Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History at the Oxford University, Director of the Middle East Center at St. Antony's College. He wrote many important books. One of them, The Fall of the Ottomans, The Great War in the Middle East, and especially a very important book, The Arabs' History. When you focus your interest in the Middle East and in the Arab world and the Ottoman Empire, and you speak about Arab diversity. We talk a lot about the Arab world today. Can you please tell us in a few words, who are the Arabs?
Well, first off, Alain, thank you for inviting me on for this conversation. The definition is elusive. The Arab world spans from the Arabian Sea overlooking the Indian Ocean to the Moroccan shores of the Atlantic. The diversity of dialect, of cuisine, of architecture, of history means that many of the people we call Arabs can't even communicate easily with each other. But I would say briefly that the Arab peoples are the people united by the Arabic language, by a common history dating back to the prophetic revelation and the origins of Islam, and that they are self-recognizing through membership of organizations like the Arab League. I mean, any country that wishes to be a member of that body is culturally, politically, linguistically Arab.
But when do they start to exist, the Arabs? I mean, you say since the beginning of Islam, but they go from Morocco to Arabia. I mean, this is a very large portion of the world. They have differences. Who are they originally? I mean, the English language links countries, like to name some, like South Africa, Australia, United States, Canada, and the British Islands. But the origin of the language is from England, is from the British Islands.
And the same is true for the Arabs. So if you want to know where the Arabs originated, it's from the Arabian Peninsula. And you have, if you like, in the Arabian Peninsula, a mixture of many different ethnicities and groups, many of whom have been lost in the mists of time. If you take the Bible as a text and look at the area from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, right through to Arabia, you run into Canaanites and Philistines and Edomites. People no longer exist. Others that we know of from their ruins, like the Nabateans, no longer exist as a people. They probably were culturally, ethnically Arab people. But we can definitely say that the Arabs, as we know them today, speaking the Arabic language, emerged from Central Arabia. They are composing magnificent poetry. Already before the advent of Islam, we have the famous mu'allaqat, the hunged poems of people like Imrul Qais. So we know that you had a fully developed Arabic language with a rich literature already in the 6th century. And we trace this to Central Arabia and South Arabia around Yemen. And I would say that that would be the place from which the Arabs originate. But when we think of the Arabs spanning that vast geography reaching right to Morocco, that is a function of the Arab conquests that come with the advent of Islam.
After the end of the First World War, many empires fall. I mean, a similar empire, let's say, to the Ottoman Empire, which is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire fall. As much as in the Balkans, in all the Austro-Hungarian countries, there are big changes. The same happens in the Middle East and in the Arab countries. Suddenly, there is a new ruler somehow. I mean, the Anglo-French people start becoming colonial and ruling all these countries from Morocco to Saudi Arabia. And they also create states, Arabic states, kingdoms here and there, which didn't exist before. Right? They decided that, I think in Cairo, I think at Churchill with Lawrence and another lady
Gertrude Bell
decided, that this will be the kingdom of Iraq, this will be Jordan, this will be this and that. So what happens?
Well, the Ottoman Empire made a fatal mistake. Under their Young Turk leadership, they went into the First World War, which, as you know, Alain, begins very much as a European conflict. There was no Ottoman cause in this war, but the Ottomans, for their own strategic reasons, opted to enter the war on the side of Germany. And from that point forward, in a sense, the fall of the Ottoman Empire becomes a chronicle of a death foretold. For the first time in their history, they're at war with the three most powerful European states, Britain, France, and Russia. And they've never faced such dangerous enemies combined. They fought an incredibly good war. And I tried to capture the ways in which the Ottomans pressed the British, the French, and the Russians in the course of the First World War in my book, The Fall of the Ottomans. But all through that war, in addition to the military campaigns, there is a diplomatic history in which the British, the French, and the Russians discuss how they will partition the Ottoman Empire once they defeat it. And in a sense, this is business as usual for Russia and France, who had been looking to secure geostrategic territory in Ottoman lands right through the 19th century. After all, these countries were not new to empire by the time of the First World War. These are established, mature empires by the 20th century. So they were looking at how they could take advantage of Ottoman defeat to enhance their empires. For Russia, they wanted Constantinople. They wanted the straits linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. They wanted more territory in the Caucasus. The French wanted Syria and Cilicia. Interestingly, the British entered World War I with no known territorial ambitions in Ottoman lands. The British had always seen the Ottoman Empire as a convenient buffer, keeping Russia out of the Mediterranean world and limiting French imperial ambitions. So they were, if you like, the only ones who hadn't been actively thinking about what territory they wanted from Ottoman lands, but they got in the game with enthusiasm very quickly. And in the course of the First World War, through famous agreements like the letters between Hussein McMahon, Sykes-Picot, the Balfour Declaration, you find Britain and France deciding on what will be a carve-up. Not only were they going to kill the sick man of Europe, but they were going to dismember him. And that gives rise to a partition of the Eastern Mediterranean from what had once been Ottoman territory into the states as we now know it of the modern Middle East.
After the Second World War, these countries start, and also around the creation of the State of Israel in the late 40s, they start to claim in different ways their independence, from Morocco to the Arab countries, to the Arab Peninsula. I mean, each one of these states tries to conquer its independence, including Algeria, who was considered by France like France, not a colonial place, but France. There was 1 million French people in Algeria living there. But at the beginning of the 50s, all these countries become independent. They have dictators, they have kings, but they assume their independence, if I am not wrong. Also, this independence, which still exists in a way, but the regimes change. A lot of things happen, and you describe them very well in your very interesting book, The Arab's History, right? Because we come to the age of Arab freedom, and then there are changes, and then there is the great influence of religion, who again changes things up to today. The oil revolution later in the 70s changes completely the picture.
These are all issues that really motivated the structuring of my book, The Arabs. These are the questions that I'm asking. I mean, in a sense, I guess, to go to the start of your synopsis, the Arab peoples were never reconciled to being colonized by the British and French. They had always felt that they deserved their independence. For, let us say, the princes of Mecca, the Hashemite princes with whom Britain had a wartime alliance, they believed that Britain had promised them an Arab kingdom in return for their having risen in revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And their partisans argued that they should be independent, that they did not need to come under French or British tutelage in statecraft. They had all it took to do this themselves. And I think for the Arab peoples, they saw it as a betrayal that as they came out of Ottoman rule, they found themselves coming under European colonial rule. So the British and French alike faced a history of resistance right through the years between the First and Second World War. And I think it made the Middle East the hardest region in the world for European imperial powers to digest. Far from proving to be prizes of the First World War, this real estate became a huge liability for the French and the British empires because, in a sense, they absorbed the Arab lands just at the moment where nationalism was becoming a global phenomenon. You could no longer treat Asian and African peoples in the mid-20th century the way you had in the mid-19th century and expect that they didn't have the kind of sophistication or political ideas or the aspiration to govern themselves. And this just made empire in the Middle East extremely difficult for Britain and France. By the time you get to the end of the Second World War, France having suffered occupation by Nazi Germany and division into Vichy and Free French territories, Britain absolutely shattered, though it survives the war victorious, only just. And so their abilities to maintain their imperial power against the determined wishes of the Arab peoples for independence was clear. They could no longer sustain it. And I think for both Britain and France, decolonization becomes a very painful process as Britain and France have to reimagine themselves as European states limited to their frontiers in Europe without the kind of global reach that made them global powers. That would now pass to the Soviets and the Americans as the dominant global powers of the post-Second World War. And as the Arab world emerges into independence, these countries find themselves almost immediately constrained by a new game, no longer empire, but the Cold War. And once again, being forced to come under the tutelage or the domination of either the Western Bloc, led by the United States and Europe, feeling very colonial, if you like, or the Eastern Bloc of the USSR and its Eastern European allies, who had a very firm notion of state and economy of their own. And I think military assistance and economic development aid were the two tools by which the Soviets and the Americans were able to force Arab states to pick sides in the Cold War. But it's something that you can see from the responses of Arab peoples they were very uncomfortable with. They were looking for genuine sovereignty, genuine autonomy. They just shucked the shackles of imperialism only to come under the new constrictions of the Cold War.
But they never became an empire. They were a community of nations. They never had a king ruler for all these countries united. They still now are a community of nations. And it's also interesting, maybe you understand it better than anybody, to see that they have an Arab League, everything, but they're not totally united in their thinking.
No, far from it.
Even vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis what happens today or happened in the past, they're not completely united in one vision.
No, of course. But I mean, we're dealing with a conflict in Israel that's evolved over 75 years. And I think that Arab perspectives on Israel have changed very much over those 75 years. In a sense, let me put that to a side for a moment. We'll come back to Israel in the Arab world because it deserves an answer in its own right. What I would say is that the idea of a united Arab world has been enormously appealing to Arab peoples really right through the 20th century. And we called it Arab nationalism through most of the 20th century. I would argue it was the most legitimate form of nationalism in the eyes of the Arab peoples. They saw their division into nation states like Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan as a divide and rule strategy by the imperial powers. Then the Arabs could be divided into smaller units and made to play against each other, that the Europeans would find it easier to dominate the Arab world. And there was this dream that if the Arabs could all unite again into one large superstate, they would be a power to be reckoned with along with the other powers of the day. They had the human capital, they had the natural resources, they had oil, they had a geostrategic location. They could be a player if only they could overcome the divide and rule imposed by European imperialism. And for the Arab peoples, that made Arab nationalism the strongest political force of the 20th century. But their experiences struggling for independence in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, had created nation states with their own national interests. We saw this in the brief moment where Egypt and Syria united to create the United Arab Republic between 1958 and 1961. And what happened, in brief, was an Egyptian colonization of Syria. And the Syrians hated it. They wanted their sovereignty back. And 3 years later, they threw away the dream of Arab unity and seceded from the United Arab Republic, the great blow to the dreams of the Arab peoples of making one United States. So I think that for the Arabs, this tension between the nation-state nationalisms of a Syria and a Lebanon and an Iraq versus the ideal of Arab nationalism has been a running tension of the 20th century, only abandoned in the last third of the 20th century, when in the failure of the Israeli war of 1967, the defeat of all Arab powers, that people began to despair of secular forms of politics and began increasingly to turn towards religious forms of transnational politics, inspired in no small part by the success of religious authorities in Iran in overthrowing one of the most deeply entrenched military dictatorships, the Shah of Iran. And you could see that where Muslims came together, they could overthrow a corrupt government, and they believed that perhaps it would not be through pan-Arab action, but through pan-Islamic action, that the people of the, in this case, Muslim Ummah could emerge as a player in the world, a power in their own right, and not be dominated by others.
This country were Muslims, but in some way secular. You know, they dress more and more like the Western people. They had the same habits. They were far from the precepts of the religion. And slowly, all that changed. No? I mean, religion is dominating, and this is unifying the Arab world from Morocco to the Arab. Now, they probably don't dress the same way, but they have this common religious link. But in the same time, these religious movements have created a lot of trouble. As you said, England, France, and many others, Italy, Germany, and even the United States are now fearing this Arab religious movement.
The fear is mutual. I think that many, particularly since the 9/11 attacks on the United States and then the violent attacks witnessed in Spain, in Britain, the Bataclan in France, there has been a sense of a West under siege by Islam. But of course, if you go to the Muslim world, the Arab world, they have a sense of a Muslim world under siege by the West with the invasion of Afghanistan, of Iraq, the imposition of democracy, where many of the partisans of Islam see Islam as the solution. This is the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood, Islam is the solution. So there is something that is mutual about this fear and loathing between the Western world and the Islamic world. But in a sense, it's a false dichotomy, because when we talk about Islam uniting the Arab world today, Islam only unites people in opposition. In a sense, we are still dealing with a very secular Arab world. Almost all the governments right through the Middle East are nation states governed by constitutions that are obviously not respected in every case, but with parliaments, with elections. We think that the elections are often corrupt, or else by monarchies that have their own institutions of government, and where the opposition is Islamist, but not the form of government. The experiments that people have had with Islamic states in the Middle East, like in Sudan, have not ended successfully. They have been overthrown. So you have the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it's not in the Arab world. You could say Saudi Arabia is an Islamic state. The Saudis themselves will say that their constitution is the Quran. But, you look at the reforms of MBS in Saudi Arabia, and you realize that even there, the state is trying to draw a line between an opposition that defines itself in Islamic terms and the government. There have been movements that have united peoples from across the Arab Islamic world. One thinks of Al-Qaeda as such a movement where Algerians and Egyptians and Iraqis might find themselves in Afghanistan fighting a jihad. But it'd be wrong to say that that meant that Iraq and Algeria and Saudi Arabia were all part of a greater Islamic state or something. That initiative, attempted between Iraq and Syria in the 2010s, was briefly successful and ultimately overcome by outside forces breaking the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS or Daesh, but also from within, by peoples who found the methods by which ISIS imposed its tyranny completely repugnant right across the Arab Islamic world. So I wouldn't talk about the triumph of the March of Islam, but I would say that it is certainly one ideology which has shown great appeal, particularly to young people across the Islamic world, feeling disenfranchised, feeling humiliated, feeling that their religion isn't respected or that their countries are dominated by outside powers. Then for them, yes, Islam is the solution. And I guess the Muslim Brotherhood has since the 1920s been advocating that view for over a century now.
At the end of the day, they want to abolish the state of Israel, or the state of Israel defends. There is war everywhere. Sometimes they try to have a moment of peace, then the war starts again. Do you think one day all this will finish?
The problem right now that makes it very hard for us to imagine a Middle East at peace is that the people in power are the very ones who have the least investment in peace. The current government headed by Khamenei in Iran is very vulnerable. It does not have, if you like, the strength with which to make the concessions that might lead to peace, whether it's about the nuclear deterrent, relations with the United States, relations with Israel. And I would argue that the same applies to the government of Israel, which is in every regard the most radical right-wing government Israel has ever had. There are people in this coalition that would never have been acceptable to an Israeli government in the past. The only way it will happen is when you have governments come to power who have the will to change the formula and have the strength to apply that change. I think at the end, I wouldn't be looking to Iran as the critical country here. I would look to Israel. And I think that change lies in the hands of Israeli voters because as a democracy, it's what Israeli voters choose that will really determine what the policy of Israel will be. And you know how divided Israel is at the moment. Deeply divided between those who are advocates of the government of Netanyahu and those who think that, he's a man who is avoiding justice and believe that he should be out of government.
What about the Arab state, the Emirates, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, all these other countries who are rather important nowadays, and they have big means and a lot of money. What role can they play in this region?
They're very interesting countries, Alain. And the list you have drawn up is exactly the right list, because these are all countries that do have the resources to provide for their citizens. They don't meet the West's expectations of democracy or representative government. These are all monarchies that are absolute monarchies, but they are the new Middle East. They are the countries that rule with, by and large, the majority consent of their populations. They're able to deliver for their populations. And they're countries that have shown a willingness to reach out to Israel, to try and stabilize the region. They're even making détente with Iran. It's so interesting for me because the center of gravity in the Middle East I grew up in was places like Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. And that now is the old Middle East. The decision-making in the Arab world takes place in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, in Kuwait, in Oman. These are the places, if you like, where meaningful politics take place and where arguably, the scope for negotiating compromise will happen. No surprise that it's in Oman that America talks to Iran, or that it's in Doha where Israel talks to Hamas. You can see that they are a very important role in stabilizing a very unstable region.
It was very interesting to talk to you about the long history of the Arabs, because not everybody knows about it. Let's hope that things will go better in the future. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Alain.
Alain Elkann interviews.